Okay, Chag HaSukkot was 2 weeks ago.
Right.
However, the glow, shall I say, of the Simcha of Mesameach B'Torah remains with me in heart and mind. And I want, even though we're a little late in terms of time scale, I'd like to share with you some of my ideas about what Sukkot is all about. Originally I entitled it Celebrating Love. And as soon as I say that, love in the contemporary picture is sexual love. You use the word love, automatically, unless you start to refine it in some way, it automatically carries this meaning of sexual love. Okay, and in that title is one of the deep points of this talk, and I'll get to it at the end. So, first, what is distinctive about Sukkot? So there are a number of things. First of all, we have a holiday of 7 days plus 1. Okay? The 7 days are related to the nations of the world, Umot Olam, because in the Korban system, which is not talking about that at all, there were 70 korbanot, 70 sacrifices that represent the nations of the world. Okay? And then Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day, represents Yisrael. So that's one point. Another point is we sit in a sukkah outside of the house. And what's that all about? And we have Lulav and Esrog, the 4 minim, which I'm not going to talk about at all tonight, but that's certainly part of the Sukkot picture. And we have, okay, enough for now. Okay, now the first point is that there's a principle that I discovered in the text of the Chumash, at least in 3 places and in others, that things are taken away, refrained from doing to appreciate. So in Pesach, there is nothing holy or significant about the matzah, even though there are a lot of drashot on matzah and so forth. But the basic point is that you eat chametz, you eat matzah on Pesach to appreciate chametz. Like Benji once said, my son, when you hear your stomach growling on Yom Kippur, for example, then you fulfill the mitzvah. What's the point of Yom Kippur? The text says, anitem. What do they call it? Afflict the soul. That is absolutely not the translation. It means to impoverish the soul. It means to take away 5 fundaments, basics of life: eating, drinking, going to work, and so forth. You take it away in order to appreciate the gift that you have. In Sukkot, it's the same thing. There is nothing special about eating in a hut. Now, today, like when I went for Sukkot the first day, it was a beautiful sukkah. It was twice the size of this living room with rugs and okay, so what's happened over time is, in affluence, the characteristics of the bayit have extended outside into the sukkah, so it's really like part of your house. But basically speaking, if you look at it like that, then you miss this point about the temporary is in the service of the permanent. Or in this case, the sitting outside in the sukkah, you can't do the things you can do in the house. You can't take 5 books and pile them on the table and start to look for sources and do relational things. Discussion is disturbed by birds and all outside. In other words, the bayit is the thing that we're stressing in Sukkot by living for 1 week outside. So it's following this rule, this general rule. Now this does not mean there are no drashot on each of these points. Because as Torah developed and got into Chazal, they on the one hand inherited certain things, but on the other hand transformed certain things, and in the process, this whole idea of taking something away to appreciate it got lost. Nobody talks about Yom Kippur like that. They still go according to the translation. What do you mean? You have to afflict the body. What kind of afflict the body? That's not a Torah point of view. The Torah wants to exonerate the body, put the body, that's part of the life system. As you'll see later, the two fundamental characteristics of life are eating and sexuality. So that when it comes to these two topics, we got everything backwards. And what's our problem today? Part of our problem is that the halachic system in the hands of rabbinic Judaism has not come to grips with the sexual revolution. We'll talk about that at the end. In other words, part of the big problem is how do we incorporate a positive approach to the body, a positive approach to the emotions. How do we incorporate that into the traditional kind of a structure and how it functions? Okay, so this is the basic point. So we have 7 days plus 1. 7 represents the 70 peoples of the world. There are korbanot that run on the first day 13, then 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, and then when you add those up, you get 70. 70 plus 1. Okay. Now, the Umot Ha'olam, the nations of the world, at their very best, the highest and most significant characteristic is philosophia, love of wisdom. In other words, when the Greeks came on the scene and introduced this focus that the unexamined life is not worth living, and Socrates and then Plato, Aristotle and the Greek, but primarily Plato and Aristotle, who carried the ball through the medieval period, love of wisdom is the Umot Ha'olam at their best. And that's what's represented in this 70 Umot Ha'olam on Sukkot. The 70 represent the love of wisdom. We could translate it and say it continues in terms of the love of science, but certainly the love of wisdom. Philosophia. Okay. So, love of mind. Philosophy is primarily related to cognition. We're dealing with intellection. We're dealing with ideas. You look at all the language in Greeks, you'll see it's all wrapped around cognition. If you'd say it appeals to feeling, where does that get in the picture? Plato banned the poets from the Republic, his ideal state, which is built on the concept of the philosopher king, where philosophy is sovereign. So Plato banned the poets because the poet went out of the strict domain of intellect and used imagination and developments of language, and so has no place in a system that's dominated by intellection, by ideas. But ideas is only 1/3 of the human being. There are feelings, there's the cognitive domain, the affective domain, and the actional domain. And all the research in cognitive psychology and its developments, and as we see today, understand, even though they don't have explanation, each one of these three exists in a field of the other two. There is no cognition without accompanying feeling and action, and there's no action without feeling and cognition, and all three. In other words, each one of these fundamental components of the human being exist in a field of the other two, and the difference between them is the emphasis, the which one is dominant. There's a principle of dominance. Which one dominates? And indeed, it starts right off the bat in Breshit when the human being is both male and female. The human being has a male dimension and a female dimension, and a man has a dominance of the male dimension. And we have to spell what that is. And the female has a dominance of the female. But each one of them exists in a field, what I call an ideational field, or an affective field, or an actional field. So, when we now say, okay, the mind yields truth. That was philosophy. The mind yields truth, closure. The highest virtue was contemplation. Because once you've got the truth, the thing is to enjoy it. But not to use it, to contemplate, to just go with it, enjoy it as a beautiful kind of a thing. But there's something higher than love of truth. Yisrael represents love of life, not love of truth. And that's what the Sukkot picture is trying to start with and develop. Namely, in relation to the Umot Ha'olam, we can differentiate and see more clearly what is distinctive about Yisrael. Because the question implicit here is, why don't we celebrate Simchat Torah, joyousness with the Torah, on Shavuot, when the Torah was given according to the tradition on Shavuot? So why are we celebrating enjoyment of the Torah in Sukkot? It should be over in the other, now, it should be over with Shavuos. Okay, halachically speaking, one answer to the question is that halachically, the Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah have a din of kapara. People who daven for the Yomid daven with a kittel, right? The one who daven, the Baal Tefillah davens with a kittel and so on. I mean, this, I forgot what I want to say. Okay.
Kapara.
So, kapara, right. So that halachically, this had a halachic, function where it's like Hashem is saying, look, we have Rosh Hashanah, and we have Yom Kippur, and then we have an extension of Yom Kippur until Shmini Atzeret, or in terms of books being open and books being closed for life and for continuance. So the book doesn't close until Shmini Atzeret Simchat Torah. Okay. But that's halachically. But conceptually, there's a difference in what we're talking about. Namely, we're comparing the Umot Ha'olam, which is in the material of the Sukkot, we're comparing it to Israel. Now, a word about two-ness and comparison. It is very important to understand that when you have two, you are better off than having one. When you have one opinion, one point of view, the refinement and the conceptualization of that has nothing to bounce off. There's no opposition. So there's being no opposition, you do develop an understanding of that one thing that you're dealing with. But you will overlook many, many characteristics of that thing if you don't have a comparison. My favorite example is Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometry. Before 1830 in Lobachevsky and non-Euclidean geometry, the word geometry meant Euclid, period. End of story. You read philosophy of mathematics, up till anybody talking about mathematics, Leibniz and Newton and so forth, up till 1830, when they talk about geometry, that is synonymous with Euclid, because there was only one geometry in the era, in the arena of intellection. That was what it meant. But when Lobachevsky and Riemann came in with alternative geometries, well, now the philosophy of mathematics and the philosophy of geometry changed, because now to explain something, you had to say, hey, wait a minute, whoa, I'm not talking about Euclid, I'm talking about Riemann. I'm not talking about the axiom set and the mistake that was made on the parallel postulate. There was a whole set of discussions that came up on the nature of axiom sets in mathematics and so on. So the philosophy of mathematics changed because there's two. There's something to compare. Now, this is very, very, very important. I found it in many different contexts and places. And especially so when you're trying to put forth a package of new ideas. If you don't have the new ideas, we go on the momentum of the old. If we have the new ideas, it's hard to get them in, but once they get a little bit in, a foothold in the door, shall we say, then we have two. The other night I heard a talk on Breshit's story, and it makes no sense. If you want to do medieval philosophy, medieval metaphysics, and interpret the story according to the Ramban, and the Malbim, which was included in the lecture, Malbim is a modern philosophy, a modern Torah philosopher. But he's still going on the momentum of the greatness of the medieval philosophers. So, again, I felt so bad. It was an hour and a half talk, and here it was, a misunderstanding of singularity in the quantum picture, first of all, a misunderstanding in his own terms, and second of all, trying to fit contemporary cosmology into the text. Now, there's no opposition. Nobody has come up with anything significant other than the Kabbalah, and the Kabbalah is not generally in the public, even though this guy Berg, who developed the whole institute and so on in California. So there is, but certainly Madonna is not going to talk about the Bria. But the point is, there's only one. There's a standard view. So I say, if the Rambam were here, he would say you do Chilul HaTorah. You do Chilul Hashem if you accept what I said about the Bria. I didn't know anything about modern science. I'm writing in the 1300s. I'm not writing in the 20th century. So why are you trying to fit something into a text that doesn't have that? So we have nothing else. Leave the Kabbalah out for the moment. We have nothing else in the popular mind. So what this person gave is what's going on in the speech, in the talks on Bereshit Bara Elokim et Hashemayim et Haaretz. Somebody come along and makes a new understanding of the text with conceptual closure, with no logical inconsistencies, but with some new ideas, and that text can carry that package. Okay, now nobody in the audience ever heard of it. I mean, it's on the machine, it's ready for getting out, the Perush and the Chumash. In there, it'll get out eventually. Somebody will pick it up and begin to put it. But then, like I always said many times, I can't lose. Because if you don't accept what I say, you have to work harder to refine the tradition. Because we got two. We got two. You can't go on momentum now. You got two now. And two means you have the Perush. It's consistent, coherent, fits the material and so on. But it's so new that you can't digest it. But in principle, and over time, you will not be able to bypass it. So I can't lose as a Torah person. So what's going to be? Like a great Rav once said, what does the Satan do with the Shomer Mitzvot? When somebody's doing Averas, he gives them Chizuk to do more Averas. And when somebody is religious, what does the Satan do? He makes them more religious. And indeed, there's a lot of wisdom in that little statement about what's being done. So that's why I stressed before the idea of two. When you have the idea of two, that you are forced by the character of the mind to refine the concepts. So we understand more about mathematical systems today after Lobachevsky and Riemann than we did before. So I'm indicating that whole point, and that's very, very fundamental, and especially when you're introducing new things. You'll see, it's not for tonight, you'll see how, I'm very big on the performative utterance of, Harei Zeh, Hegdesh, I am Jewish, as a declaration, not as a statement, as a declaration. We talk about ourselves in conversation many times, but I'm Jewish, but I'm American. Well, the voice changes because the conversation was quiet. All of a sudden something was said, and then it has an intonation, it has some schmaltz behind the words. It's not just monotone. When you're giving lecture in general and you're appealing to the mind, you keeping it straight as possible. I know as writing up something, I don't like the word because I used it 5 times.
Which word?
Any word. You use it 5 times. But you want to keep the word in the phrase so that in the next page you don't give the reader an opening to say, is he talking about the same thing in different words or is he not? Well, if you use the same word, obviously you're talking about the same thing. Okay, but if you don't, then you give that opening and you lose power in communication. But sometimes it just doesn't fit the sentence. It just sticks out for whatever the reason. It doesn't fit the syntax, it doesn't have the music of your writing. And so you're very tempted to change. At least to raise the question, should I continue with the term or should I change it? And let it for the reader to go. Because sometimes you are talking about the same thing, but you have another nuance. You have another little dimension that's implicit, and the change of language will open that up for the reader. He may say, oh, he's talking about not exactly the same thing. What is he talking about? And so you have another aspect for the communication. So it can work both ways. But basically, our paradigm here is mathematics. In mathematics, there are no vague terms. Everything is defined with a special artificial language and a notation in logic and so on. Everything is defined exactly in univocal terms. One term, one meaning. In life and in experience, well, we live in a world of vagueness. It's a miracle that we can communicate to each other in language. I heard Piaget once gave 2 lectures at New York University in the States, and one of the things he said was that he's studying language all his life, the origin of language in the child. As far as he's concerned, it's a miracle.
It's what?
It's a miracle that the average child at age 3, 4 learns how to speak. It's unbelievable. I can say now about how they learn to walk. Because I got a problem to walk, so you could see the greatness and the miracle of being able to walk. I mean, unbelievable. Anyway, so what do we have? So first we have this point about the love of truth. So one of the points I made before, and I'll stress it now, and then I'll take it in a different direction, it relates primarily to the mind. Okay, you could understand that. And it relates to the individual. So that in terms of individual versus society, the individual versus the group, versus the family, versus the country, versus the world, and so forth, love of truth relates to the individual. Of course, there are overflows where a culture can have dimensions, but basically the individual is what's primary. And love of life does not direct itself exclusively to the mind, as we said before. And further, it expresses itself in the dimension of group, of man and wife, of family, of different organic unities that comprise a life system. A life system is made up not just of individuals. And as you get to a certain critical number, things change. The individual shifts and changes and so on. And that's part of sociology and psychology, to work out all those significant changes. But the point is here that philosophia, love of wisdom, has a primacy on the individual and not on the organic dimension of society. Indeed. What's his name? Wrote a book, Popper. Karl Popper wrote a book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. Beautiful, nice chunk of reading for homework. The first part was Plato, the second part was Hegel. He took two philosophers of Western civilization and he showed how totalitarianism is built into philosophia. Because if you have a closure and you have truth, not only do you have one side, the virtue of contemplation, but on the other side, it means everybody else is in falsity unless they agree. And so what happens over time is a degeneration and the emergence of force, of totalitarianism. So Popper, who was a 20th century philosopher, he's an economist in England, and he wrote on verification, what's called the falsification principle, that a sentence has no meaning unless it's in principle falsified. So you can say the moon is made of green cheese, well, that can be falsified. If it can be falsified, it's in the running for truth. If it can't be falsified, it's not in the running for truth. So Popper was a 20th century philosopher dealing with the full range of epistemological problems of contemporary philosophy, but he included in his corpus this book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, and Plato was the classical example and Hegel was the contemporary example, out of which came, eventually, there was a Hegelian contribution to what eventually became Nazi Germany and so forth. So that it's not the total picture, making a simplification, but the point was that I proposed it once for a dissertation for somebody. To me, Kant, who was one of the great ethicists concerned with ethics, worked out the concept of duty, worked out the concept of obligation. To me, Kantian philosophy had the positive side, where Kant was the greatest of the moderns and most difficult to understand. Anybody who took a course on Kant had to work to understand it. But the point was that there was a dimension in here of the, about the nature of lying and so on, and the whole picture. But on the other hand, as philosophy developed after Kant into the 19th century, Kant is, I think, 1750, whatever it was. So, as he moved into the 19th century, Kantian philosophy, to me, also played a role in the emergence of the nationalistic state and what eventually became Nazi Germany. Now, it's not a straight line where you say, well, I'm going to take this and I'm going to derive it and so on. But what was the point? The point was that obligation, duty, in Kant, eliminated self-interest, eliminated greatest good for the greatest number, eliminated utilitarianism. And that elimination of utilitarianism was firing on one cylinder. Instead of having the human being looked at from the point of view of different functions, obligatory and concerned with self-development. So there was no place for freedom. There was no place for freedom. Obligation excludes freedom. You're not free. You don't have self-interest. So the whole utilitarian orientation from Bentham through John Stuart Mill, the great libertarian, into the contemporary period, into the 20th century, was a restoration of a balance with Kant. But Kant, without that, sounds like a great, great ethical system, but to me, has in it ethical dimensions, which were developed in time as the material went into the 20th century. Okay, so here's Papa writing a book on Plato. Now, when you took Plato, when anybody took a Plato course, philosophy 101 is Plato. Philosophy begins with Plato. Civilizations begin with the Greeks. Everybody else was a barbarian, and for good causes. I mean, it wasn't just a zero. Remember, Greek. There was love of wisdom, and developed and worked out was the Greek orientation. And so I remember when I was a kid, going to college, philosophy begins, civilization begins. In Columbia University, they had chapters in Western civilization. I still have the book here, a classic book. Everybody used it all over the country. It was from Columbia, chapters in Western civilization. So it begins with Homer, and that's it. Civilization began with Homer. That's 800 BC. Okay, well, somebody came on the scene and said, it was a guy Nugabor or whatever his name was. He said, he wrote a book on Babylonian astronomy. Hey! But there was astronomy, there was some knowledge before the Greeks. It was a shocker. I couldn't put the book down. I read the book and I said, wow, especially a Torah person. We're dealing with Chumash, we're dealing with the Navi, we're dealing with source material that's 800 years before the Greeks, 1300 BC, whatever, even further back, but at least that. So, what do you mean? There's nothing here? We're in this no man land of something missing, something great missing. Okay, now this is not to belittle Plato, Aristotle, and the Greeks. I mean, but on the other hand, there's something that all of a sudden opened up after this book, and people started to realize that there was a Canaanite world and a Assyrian world and a Babylonian world and a this and an Egyptian world, and before you turn it around, there are hundreds of books on the whole Near East at the earlier times, and it showed that they weren't barbarians. They had knowledge packages. They had insights, and we, as Torah people, using Chumash material and Navi material, are part of that civilization and culture. So we had then an opening to start to look at. There's another example off the bat of Tunis, right? Before that, it was taken as a given. You didn't have anything to compare it with. Now you have a literature to compare it with, so you compare Greek world to the Babylonian world to the Egyptian world, and you now have a refinement of both. You have the new knowledge about what this world was like, and on the other hand, you can now use it to bounce off and compare Greek culture, Greek civilization, Greek philosophy with something else. Just off the cuff, another example of this way the mind works when you have the ability to have two. When you have something two, you can then refine, you're pushed to refine the concepts on both sides. So it's one of those things that you can't lose unless you say refinement and conceptual advance is nothing. If you take it seriously, then that's where we go. We have this extra dimension. Okay, so this is just to bring again this whole idea of philosophy, philosophia, being localized in the cognitive, one point, and second, localized in the yachid, in the individual, but not in the tzibur, not in the whole organic orientation. Okay, now, I said in the beginning that I originally entitled this talk as Celebrating Love, with the point being implicit in the title is this differentiation between the nations and Yisrael, where there's something higher than love of truth, and that's love of life. And so you can see for yourself, when you start to fill that in, we have a much richer picture of this love, this concept. And furthermore, included in it is the colloquial meaning of love, which always has a sexual component. The way the word is used, without clarification of what you're talking about, love automatically connotes sexual love. Okay, so I say yes. Very good. How are we supposed to look at all of this? We have now in Hollywood, we have a worship of love, a worship of Chaim, a worship of sexuality. So we have all the aberrations that go with it. But in the big picture, that's a return to the primacy of life. In my view, it's going through an excess. We have a sexual revolution from Freud and Kinsey and so forth, which is 50 years, 60 years, 70 years. It started earlier. There's some insights in Rousseau and Nietzsche and so on, but basically it's a 20th century phenomenon. And in the big picture, that's a positive thing. It's going through a worship stage, but it will iron out. And even we see it in like award-winning movies, Emmys, TV awards. If you look at them and you see who's winning the awards and the films that are winning the awards, they are not pornographic. They are not unduly sexual in terms of aberrations of the sexual domain. They are included in that, of course. If you don't have sex in the movie, it won't sell. But what's inside of the big picture that looks so bleak and so terrible, and eroticism and so on, what looks as such a disturbing thing for civilization, inside of it you still have positive things. You have positive things that are coming out. Sensitization. Call it a sensitization literature. After Freud, Nietzsche, and so on, there's a sensitization literature. You can't walk around and be ignorant of the sexual domain from different aspects. You can't walk around today and be ignorant of nutrition. These are million-dollar businesses because they are relating to life. They are real. It's not just a fad or a fashion. There's reality. And these two fundamental components of Chaim are built into this differentiation on Sukkot between love of wisdom and love of life. And so the way to look at the picture in a big frame is like similar to what the Rambam did when he wrote about Christianity. So in Hilchot Malachim, at the end of the Mishnah Torah, Rambam gave an interpretation that Christianity came on the scene to civilize, to introduce morality into the pagan world. So in the big picture, he said, look, I'm not going to deal with the small thing about these pagan customs and so how disgusting they are and so on and so on. I read the Nabatean agriculture and did this and did that, and you see it. Look, I was once on a Roman kick. I read Macrobius, one of the Roman people, talking about digestion and food. Oh God. You felt like throwing up by reading it. This is Macrobius. This is like Cicero or Macrobius and the Latin writers, but the description of eating was animal. It was animal-like. You had to turn away in disgust. But so here the Rambam didn't center on that. So the Rambam said, no, in the big picture, there's something positive in the development of Christianity and the thing. This is the way I am looking at the sexual revolution, and it's functioning to restore the primacy to life vis-a-vis philosophia. And so that's what I meant, that hidden in the title that I originally had was celebrating love. Yes, we are celebrating love, which includes sexual love. And indeed, the problems of the day are rooted exactly here, either in problems of obesity, self-respect, and so on, so on, so on, having to do with the nutrition world, and the domain of sexuality, all the anxiety, all the tension, everything in modern contemporary life, Freud talked about and said, oh my God, you can't drink a cup of coffee without anxiety. You're living in a world full, at every level, especially the male-female relationship, man-wife relationship, homosexuality, and all the rest. In other words, we're dealing with a sexual revolution that is setting forth the basic problems for civilization, basic problems for culture. And we, as Torah people, have the challenge, just like all the other peoples of the world, we have the same challenge. How do we incorporate the results of the sexual revolution into a halachic system that originated and developed in a time when there was no sexual revolution in the sense we talk about today. There was function, there was concern, there were reasons for that. Why there was. There was always prostitution, but there were reasons why having children was the fundamental property of a woman, to give birth. Okay, today you can't talk like that anymore, because there are advances in technology, and there are advances of all types in this whole thing, and you get a different picture. We are in a sexual revolution, and our problem is, how do we shift, transform, infuse existing culture and civilization with the teachings, the positive teachings that come out of this revolution. And we have to eat the daisa. Okay, fine. We have to realize that it's a worship. A worship is not love. So it's a worship. But inside the worship, there's a bigger picture. And it's the restoration of this focus of attention. And a concept of Judaism, or what I call Jewishness, because Judaism as a religion has faded out as the fundamental word. The word today is Jewishness, because there's a double side. On the one hand, the rabbinic Judaism, as being the watcher and the shomer of the halachic system for a number of centuries, have been unable to meet the challenges of the sexual revolution in sexuality and nutrition. And so there's grown up people who are Jewish in one respect or another, but are not Judaism followers. When you talk to people, you see the majority of Jews in Israel and the United States are concerned, they have Jewishness, as indicated by conversation and eating and all kinds of things. But they have a frame of Jewishness covering a tremendous spectrum. But I look at that as in a way of trying to, on the one hand, restore or transform or infuse Judaism with Jewishness. It used to be the other way around, that when you said Jewish, you meant Judaic, follower of the tradition. I'm working on the proclamation of the state, and it's so interesting to see that the word Judaism doesn't appear in the proclamation. The phrase Jewish people, 7, 8 times. The word Jew and Jews. Now, for most of the people who wrote the document, who wrote the proclamation, for Ben Gurion and so forth, these words, the Jewish people, they had an element, or they grew out of, Judaism. Okay? This is 1948 I'm talking about. Okay? But they're included in there was the full range of people. There were people who were enamored by the Marx. If you read the early Marx, you will see and Avenari in his book on Marx points it out, you'll see the Jewish sniff, the Jewish flavor. When I read Marx, there's Marx with Engels, there's Marx in Das Kapital, in the economic, there's different dimensions of Marx, but the early Marx it's a mechaya to read. It's humanistic. It has an uplift. And so we're not talking about communism, we're not talking about socialism, we're talking about the beginnings of these things in a philosophical picture that came out of Hegel and Marx's critique of Hegel and so on and so on. But when you read it, you see that this was part of the Jewish soul, the Jewish neshama. So people who signed the proclamation, they considered themselves part of the Jewish people. But they didn't necessarily agree with the messianism, for example, as envisioned by the prophets. Right off the bat, they didn't want God in the picture. They didn't want God's name in the text. But, come on. It closes by saying the Rock of Israel. If you look up the text in Chumash and in Novi, you'll see that refers to God. So, they didn't want the word God in the text, and there were machlok and arguments, but the text has a Judaic flavor, a dimension, here, envisioned by the prophets. Freedom, justice, and peace, envisioned by the prophets. Did they do homework? Did they go and make special committees and rooms and discuss what freedom, justice, and peace are? They took it for granted. Everybody knew. Mature people. A mature person today knows what freedom is, what justice is, what peace is. He never read anything. He's not a reader. It's not for philosophers. A philosophy person has to give a course on John Stuart Mill. He has to read the book. I mean, but other than that, the average person, in common sense, picks up what freedom is and what it's not, and has difficulty with boundary cases and so on. But basically, we could live with the vagueness, put it this way, and have a communication where we're not just talking past each other. But for the specialist, okay, there's a lot of work to be done to understand what freedom is, what peace is, what justice is. As a matter of fact, for me, being in academia so long, we, as academia, have failed miserably in Western civilization to clarify sufficiently what democracy is and what it's not, what science is and what it's not. We have a whole range of materials that are mythic, that are imaginative, that are not germane to the topics. We don't read the right books. If you went around and asked how many people read the Federalist Papers, how many people read De Tocqueville, Democracy in America, 1830, how many people read, even further back, Montesquieu and Spirit of the Laws, and blah, 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 blah. Blank. Today, who reads this stuff? I mean, yeah, I say, if your work requires, you're writing something, okay. But other than that, who's concerned? There's an indifference, but there's enough common knowledge of what these things are. So, okay, in academia, there's a place for doing more exploration. But it depends who's doing it. Who's giving the course? As you know, relativism, ethical relativism, moral relativism, dominated academia and still does in the United States and England and other places, Israel as well. It dominates the whole picture. There are no absolute values, there are only relative values and so on. And so there was, when I came into philosophy as a Jewish guy looking for some understanding of Judaism from the philosophical point of view, well, the thing was relative. You had to fight relativism. You had to fight relativism in politics, for example. Lasswell, Herbert Lasswell was the power politics leader of power politics, factions, the functions of the political machine, and so on, so on, so on, so on. And we came to college and we say, oh my God, that's what politics is all about? Power shifts and this, and majority vote, and under the table diplomacy, and this and that, and all the things. Wow, There must be something else. So we all ran to Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss was a philosopher, political philosopher from Germany, who came out of Germany, taught in the New School for Social Research. Then in the University of Chicago is where I met him and took his courses. And Leo Strauss was the antidote to power politics because he went back to Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and so on, and the great books, Xenophon and Montesquieu and Hobbes and Locke and the whole tradition. And so when you read his books, you saw something else about politics. You started to deal with the values, with the value dimension, what it's supposed to achieve, what are the complications, what are the set of problems, and so forth. And how did it develop over time in history? And so I read Strauss more than any other person in the 20th century when I was involved at Chicago and university, trying to understand something about the political. Strauss was the view. As a matter of fact, the students of Strauss printed up his lecture notes. I think it's 60 volumes. They printed up, it was given out to a very few, the inside students. I wasn't an insider. I just took the course, but I wasn't an insider. But when I got out and I started to teach, I found myself, and even today, I found myself reading Strauss more than anybody else because he was refreshing. He had another dimension, which put in balance and said politics is much more than that. It must have some value dimension. It must have some pull on the person. What is a citizen? What is the good citizen? And so on, and all of these types of questions. Of course, it's an education. De Tocqueville came here from France in 1820, 1830, whatever it was, and wrote the 2-volume book on democracy in America. The first one is on government, pretty dry. But the second volume is on the different socio-political characteristics of the American people. Well, to me that's general education. I mean, but how many people have read this stuff? I mean, nobody, or in the courses, how many people took the time to put Strauss on the reading list? We put Strauss on the reading list and forgot about Laswell. But the pattern, the development, the thing that was moving was politics. And power politics was the textbooks and so on and so on developed. And so you had this interchange, and then that result was a dominance, an overkill, in the literal sense of the word, an overkill of liberal egalitarian mentality. You had Justice Douglas in the Supreme Court in the United States, who dealt with the Brown versus Board of Education, the civil rights, the whole civil rights issue, and so Douglas says, Chief Justice, Supreme Court, we're not dealing with a lawyer, we're not dealing with the city and the state, we're dealing with the highest level. So Justice Douglas said, well, the Ferguson case of 1897, which established separation of Negroes from whites in different contexts, they were biased. Wow. They were biased. But that was the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of 1897, they were biased. So what did he do? The result was he degraded the Supreme Court so that when the civil rights issues came to fore, the court and the Supreme Court was, who the hell is the Supreme Court? Douglas just mavaddled the whole thing. And when you read, I wrote away to Congress to get his, there's a lot of stuff that you can get free. Just write to, write to Congress and you get. So I used to teach and show the students the kinds of things he wrote and what he wrote in the write-up and what he wrote in other notes to this and that and the governmental different functions, how they gave strength to the whole idea of relativism, that there are no real values that stand above. Now that still remains an issue, but at least it's been a little bit modified. Not as sharp, but it's basically the same problem of the student it's translated, it transformed itself into indifference. A lot of indifference on all things like that. People, I knew a guy here who was a newspaper man for many years, and he said, look, they don't read the paper in Israel. They read the sports page. That's it. They don't read the paper. They don't read, they're not abreast of the news. They're not following what's going on. In any event, the picture here is, to sum up the point, we have love of wisdom in the context that I'm talking about, and love of life, and indeed we have Simchat Bet Shoeva, bringing the water for the Beit HaMikdash was a big, big thing, and indeed water is the sustenance of life. You can't live without water. So again, we have another indication, a lesser one than the sexual revolution, but here we see the water. I think the prayer for rain, I don't know whether it's linked here with the Sukkot or not. But for the fact is, we do pray for rain on Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. One last point has to do with something that's very close to me and that I'm working out. You heard it many times. I am very big on the performative utterance. What that is very simple, that in the legal system, our primary examples, in the legal system, you do things to establish legal statuses. You say, Hareyat Mekudeshet, will you marry me? And you give a ring. Usually the words go together with an action. When you do that, the person who 1 minute ago was single is now married. It's not cause. It's not causation. It's exactly the same person it was yesterday. But the performative utterance said in the right context with the right conditions, because if a katan of 2 years old says, will you marry me? He didn't say anything. Well, he didn't say anything. It's on the tape. But in legal terms, he didn't say anything. It has no effect. So, the primary illustration is legal systems. Every advanced legal system has a performative. It's built on the notion of the performative. So, further, I don't limit it to the legal system. I widen it up in a very, very big, comprehensive way. One of the clues for that is that in the contemporary period, the use of the performative has entered the personality psychology literature of identity. And there's big, you plug in on Google, you have all kinds of articles, and people, there's a field of personal psychology that's built on the performative. This guy Zafran and Logan, that I quote all the time, is a recent book. He calls it the laws of performance, 3 laws of performance, is built explicitly on the performative utterance. So I developed it in a very, very large way. In the last analysis, it's a new paradigm for philosophy. It's a different entrance into understanding the big picture and the different facets that were heretofore handled by philosophy in a truth context. And our Western civilization has been dominated by the language, the use of language which is assertion, true or false. The assertive use of language. In addition to that, 20th century philosophy has revealed very significantly there's an emotive use of language. For example, when you give advice to somebody or you command, that's not an assertion. It's not true or false. It's either you obey it or you don't obey it, or it's worded properly. It's efficacious or not efficacious. There's nothing to do with truth or falsity. So there's the assertive use of language, there's the emotive use of language, and then there's the performative use of language. And in the performative use of language, what I found was there's a linkage between love of life and the use and the primacy of performative language over assertion. When somebody is giving a talk Okay, don't take me, I'm not a good example, because I talk with my hands and so on. But usually, like a good Yekka, a good German professor, it's a monotone, and there's no excitement. There's no raising, there's intonations. There are very few gestures, there's very little body language. And so you have a language form, a use of language that fits the picture of love of wisdom, that fits this whole picture that I'm drawing from the Greek point of view about the nations at their best. So they're dealing with assertion, with the assertive use of language, primacy. And there are other uses. And so when I emphasize the performative, well, I'm making it's a new paradigm. Because the paradigm for all language is conversation, for me. Conversation means take a slice, half hour, put it on a tape. You will see instantaneous movement from assertion, advice giving, command, performative. You'll see all the uses of language, these primary three. Gesture is another one that was the earliest, but to deal with, because gesture includes onomatopoeia. But so let's say 3 or 4 fundamental uses of language for communication. So you have these 4, and you see that there's a place for a rethinking of the primacy of assertion. That if we would start to substitute non-assertive language for assertive language, we would widen up culture, widen up civilization, because somehow the assertive language has built into it this no gesture, no feeling, the minimum the better, no product. When we went to school, you're not allowed to put yourself in the picture. I'm writing a book on proclamation. I'm writing a book on Spinoza, whatever. So I have to tell the reader how I got the point. He don't give a damn. He wants to know what's the argument. I said it is a refutation of Spinoza. What's your argument? And when I was younger, I used to have that as my model. Philosophize with a sword. Wow. Just the language. How could a guy, an adult person, use such language? They say philosophize with a sword. Namely, until the guy that you're talking to is dead on the floor from argument that he can't talk. He starts opening his mouth. You studied all the arguments, like when you prepare for giving a lecture. You got the stuff clear, and there's no surprises. So you philosophize with a sword. Well, when I look back on that, look back on 40 years of life, I realized that was a part of me that I don't have today. I would never philosophize with a sword. I would say the other way around. I want everybody to follow what I say. But when they don't, I want to hear what they have to say on their own. So when I used to mark papers in a philosophy course, so the goal was for the student to take a stand on the issues. So much so that I once had a paper that was mixing up Mill with somebody else, I forget already, and I think it was Rousseau, whatever, and they mixed up, and they said things about Mill that were really about Rousseau. Well, what do you do with a paper like that? It's all wrong, it's a 0. I mean, Mill didn't say that, Rousseau said that. Well, I just wrote a note, and I graded the paper on the content of the paper. So he was all wrong. So I said, you made a mistake. For whatever the reason, you made a mistake, you mixed up the two philosophers. Don't do that, that's in trouble. But as far as the student was concerned, the fact that he had in it material that showed reflection, that showed grappling with the differences between two people and so on, was enough for me to give the guy an A or a B, whatever I gave him. But it certainly wasn't worth an F. Whereas you say, well, take it literal, it's 0. It's all wrong. It's like a wrong page in a dictionary, You look at one word and he's giving you a different definition. Anyway, what I'm trying to show here in this last point for this evening is that with this whole differentiation between love of life and love of wisdom, goes a shift in the dominance of the language, of the kind of language that we use in ordinary life, and especially in academic life, in ordinary. So, just to give an example at the end, I said, instead of entering the document, I'm writing on the proclamation of the state. So, 35 years ago when I wrote a draft, I was truth-oriented. I just said, what is it talking about? What is freedom? What is justice? What is this? What is that? What's the definitions? What's the argument? How does the thing stand? What is natural right? What is the whole business? Now, when I look at it, I said, well, maybe it's all wrong. Let's start with a person says, I'm an Israeli. Not as an assertion, but as a declaration. To declare is to say, I declare, that's implicit. There's a confusion about assertions and performatives that they could easily say, well, I'm Jewish, I'm an Israeli. Well, that's true or false. Here's my Teudat Zahut, that's enough of a definition, say I'm Israeli. So it could be, it's an assertion, but it also could be that it's a performative that's disguised in the grammar of an assertion. X is this, X is that. Okay, so that has to be ironed out and cleared up, that there is a little problem here of how do you do that. But there are, like in conversation, all of a sudden the guy says, I'm Israeli. Usually you would say, but I'm Israeli. Well, you don't hear the but that's part of the language. So I'm suggesting that with the shift, let's now say, let's enter the document in a different way. Not from the point of view of truth, but from the point of view of what associates in consciousness. The moment you say, I'm Israeli, what are the things that come into consciousness? Capture them. Capture them as best you can. What are the associations that spring to mind when you say and declare, I'm an Israeli? Capture those over a number of times and make a network of implications, or shall we say not implications, the wrong word because that's logic. Associations. Associative is the word. There are associations in the person, each individual, with the identity performatives that he makes on himself. So he says, I'm Israeli. That's the performative. But the performative is associated with a package that we could start to put together on the table. Now, the guy says, I'm Israeli. And he mentions this, and he mentions that, and he mentions this, and he doesn't even mention the proclamation. Now, if 100 people who say, I'm Israeli, don't even mention it in any way whatsoever, that says that the proclamation is not doing any talking. There's no relevance. There's total indifference. It's not relating to anything he says. Somebody may say, oh, it's politics as usual. There was compromise, there was politicians, there was Ben Gurion, he was a bad guy, and this guy was a good guy, and this guy, Okay, so, proclamation. Yeah, this guy talks about the proclamation, or it's just part of consciousness. It just comes in as a talk. I'm talking stream of consciousness, so he captures things that are spontaneous, because in the studied discourse, you don't capture the person when you're dealing especially with identity. So he's making an identity proclamation, he's entering the document, and now the method should be to collect those associations in a package and begin to make some generalizations about the associations that relate to the performative, the identity performative that the person made. So, it's a different entry into the document. Instead of starting like we were taught, you want to study the document, read the thing, it's 2 pages, read the thing, it's on the wall over there, read the two pages, and start to talk about what it's all about, what's the concepts. That's what I did 35 years ago, what's the concepts. But for whom? For me, oh sure, you're a philosopher, you're a teacher, your work requires that you know something about, so you study it. But for the Hamonan, people living here, for everybody to say nothing about the document says something. So it means it's boiled down to meat and potatoes on a barbecue. The American people have much more respect for the Declaration of Independence than the Israelis have for the proclamation of the state. Of course, 1776 is not 1976 and the 21st century. However, there is, in terms of concept, the American Declaration is built on natural right. That's a not viable concept. It's human rights. Read the UN Charter, the UN thing that was responsive. It's the human rights. Natural right is a concept that went out with Rousseau. It was a crisis of natural right. It's out. The Israeli proclamation uses it, but it tries to build itself on historic right. It's natural right and historic right, and what that is, and so on, is all the complications. But should it be that it's irrelevant completely? Should it be? How do we teach it? How do we teach it in the schools? What do we do in terms of the the curriculum? How do we make it relevant to the contemporary guy? So I say, if we start with the document, you'll never make it relevant. If you start with the person, you're starting with relevance built in, because that stream of consciousness is telling you something about him. Because for just as many who say nothing, there'll be others who say different things about the proclamation. By studying those responses, one opens up a wider perspective look at the document, which has much more functionability, operability for relevance, to cut through the indifference, the tremendous indifference that is operative today in the States and in the country. So the last point for tonight was just to illustrate how all things are connected, and something that you would never think is connected is connected. And when you look at the biblical world of Moshe, the primary language use was the performative, not the assertion. The assertive use of language came to its highlight in the Nevi'im, when they theologized the system. And the basic Torah Moshe orientation was the performative. Zachary once sent me something on Levi Strauss. I even recommended the student they should read a piece from him before they start to study the Chumash, because you'll get a good example. I stress a lot of the anthropological approach linked up with this performative. So, and you read a good anthropologist, he's the dean of anthropology in the 20th century, so it pays to read him and see by example how he deals with a real culture. Here we're not dealing with a real culture, we're dealing with a construction. I don't have any culture now that we're investigating, but we're dealing with a construction which is real, existed at the time. And it was built primarily on the concept, with respect to language, not on assertion, on the performative and the emotive use in advice and command. Command language is part of the whole picture, as well as the performance. So what we're showing is, if you had to say, I just finished rereading, Rousseau wrote a book. He wrote his famous discourses on the arts and science, origin and inequality. And in his methodology, he was an anthropologist. He was making a construction. He didn't examine, early societies. He had basic knowledge that he took. He put it together, and he developed a concept to understand civil society. So the concept he developed was man in a state of nature, and in that description, he has in it the primacy, or shall we say, not the primacy, but at least he touched upon the non-assertive use of language. That was part of civil society. That was part of civilization, the social contract. But the book of Origin of Discourse on Inequality was something that had an anthropological method, an anthropological tone. And so I said, in respect to the Chumash, we have to enter like anthropologists, not like historians. History only gets to a certain point, but doesn't deal with the origin and development of customs that come back from a long time. History has a certain primacy on the contemporary, then linked up to the past, but the level of abstraction is not the level of abstraction that's good for an anthropologist. Anthropologists, if you read an anthropology book, there are a lot of space devoted to description of what is going on, how things are moving, what's the daily life. You want a picture of what the guy did from the morning. History doesn't deal with that. History is at a level of abstraction which deals with more abstract things, not so much concreta. And what we want now is a method that deals with more concreta. Or, in the case of a performative, the language itself has in it gesture, has in it movement, has in it tone, has in it shift. In some places, all of a sudden, you go musical, or some places you go quiet, and you vary your voice. And then all of a sudden, that's all part of non-assertive uses of language. So the last point here was just to indicate and open up, because that's where we are, opening up the whole idea of a new philosophical paradigm that is not built on assertion, true or false, or possible in modal logics, but is built on the association between identity performatives and string of consciousness and things that are captured. If you see and you read the material, you'll see when I wrote about 20 pages on Moshe Rabbeinu's concept of life energy, his concept of time, and so forth, it turns out there's no history. There are packages of nows. There's no history. The Hebrew language, as other language, Assyrian and Egyptian, have no past tense. Now, we can't imagine that. We can't imagine a language that has no past tense. Because we think linear, we think in this cause-effect frame, but what was called logic or communication in ancient Israel, in the Moshe Rabbeinu period, before the prophets, was a kind of forcefulness on a person by building up associations that all of a sudden bang them on the head. So that you associate it, and the word is association. And you package these associations they're associating with the identity performers. You package them. That was what we would call logic. So when I wrote a piece on the Moshe Rabbeinu's concept of logic, it's very far removed from the Western view. And indeed, I showed that if you look at it carefully, you see there's no history. And so I entitled the book on the proclamation, The Dissolution of Historic Right. Dissolution. There ain't no historic right because there ain't no history in an approach that I call Moshe life energy, performative linkage together, this whole package that we're talking about. All of these are together and they lead to a conclusion. Just as there is no past tense in the language, there is no concept of history. So I called the book The Dissolution, not Dissolution, The Dissolution of Historic Right. There ain't no such thing. So not only is there no historic right, it's a form of convention, because that was on the basis of natural right. Natural right was unchanged. It comes from God, the creator of the natural laws. But historic right was by convention. You could change it. So when you're reading the proclamation of the UN that was published in 1948, so in that proclamation, it's human rights. universal human rights, universal declaration of human rights. And so the whole thing has shifted away from a philosophical picture to be very narrow-minded, to say, oh, let's take the whole document and put it by convention. Plato would say, well, that's convention. But in between, there was a social contract, and there was a whole development of political philosophy, which gives a basis for the UN 32 set principles of the thing, which I use in the book because part of the right to make a state came from international law via the United Nations, which is that proclamation. How that worked and so on and so on, and I put it in there to compare. I even put it in the appendix, a few sections, so the reader can see the proclamation of Israel in English, in Hebrew, and then the Declaration of Human Rights, and the American Declaration. I decided not to put it in the index, but it's too long. But the point is that the reader could see the primary sources from which the stuff in the proclamation is being taken. But the basic point, to conclude for this evening, is this whole idea of the re-looking at the identity performatives and how they could function for a different paradigm of philosophy and a different paradigm for culture.